This episode of the podcast is sponsored anonymously in honor of Dr. Ben-Tsiyon Klibansky, a special and inspiring person whose work in disseminating the history of Lithuanian Yeshivas has inspired so many, including this sponsor. May Hashem give him the strength to keep up his important work. If anyone would like to support the podcast, to sponsor an episode, or for any questions, comments, or general feedback, please email me sfarimchatter@gmail.com. Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Dr. Ben-Tsiyon Klibansky, who is a lecturer at Ephrata College in Yerushalayim, and he's the author of the book, which was just translated to English, called The Golden Age of the Lithuanian Yeshivas, published by Indiana University Press. I will be discussing the book and in general the Lithuanian Yeshivas, especially of the interwar period, and so on. So thank you, Dr. Klibansky, for joining me.
Yeah, good day to you, Nachi, and to our listeners.
Okay, so let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, I was born in Vilna, which was the capital of Soviet Lithuania in those days, to an observant family. My grandfather was Avram Lagleben. He was the spiritual head of the Vilna Jewish community, and he delivered regular shiurim in Mishnayos and in Yaakov. We spoke just Yiddish at home, which was unusual in those days and maybe also today. And only when I entered the kindergarten, when I was 4 or 5 years old, I quickly absorbed the Lithuanian language and afterwards also the Russian one. It was, as I mentioned, the Soviet era, a very difficult time for Jews, Judaism, and of course, there were no Jewish schools in Lithuania at that time. I attended a high-level Lithuanian school where studies were also on Saturdays, Shabbat, and only on the high holidays did I get permission not to come to school in order to attend the prayers in the synagogue. By the way, it was the choral synagogue Taras HaKodesh, the only synagogue in Vilna then and to this day. After 13 years of my father's struggle with the KGB, he was privileged to receive a permit to leave Lithuania. It was in 1969, and naturally we made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. So here I studied in religious schools, then electronics engineering at Tel Aviv University. I made bachelor or master of science. And I also served in the IDF for many years. I was a high-rank officer in the Israeli NSA. And as I knew very well the tremendous impact of the actions of my soldiers and officers, I considered my army service as a mission for Am Yisrael. After completing my military service, I was offered an excellent job in Israeli high-tech, but at that time I started thinking about a change, a turnaround. I was well acquainted with the history of my family and of the Lithuanian Jewry in general, and I knew that very few of these Jews survived the Holocaust, only about 4%, including my parents, who were, and today we can add the word fortunately or miraculously, they were deported to Siberia and the North Pole Circle just few days before the Nazis entered Lithuania, and therefore I can speak with you today. I saw myself as one of the few sons of survivors, and I thought it appropriate to research and write about the history of the destroyed Lithuanian Jewry to which I belonged, and which was once the cornerstone of the whole Jewish world. So for this, I turned to studying Jewish history at Tel Aviv University. And very quickly, I began my postgraduate studies, and I got my PhD in 2009. And from then on, I'm researching the history of Lithuanian Jewry, writing books, articles, and our listeners may find and freely download all my articles from my site if they want. So this is more or less my background. One would say complex, in brief.
Okay, and for your site, I'll put up a link to that listeners can find that. I mean, just one question. So you growing up from in the Soviet Union, I mean, what was that like?
It was very difficult. My grandfather he kept all the mitzvahs and sukkah and everything. also my parents, but they were compelled to work on Shabbos. And also as I said, I had to study on Shabbos, but except of it, we had Zviras on Shabbos, we had all the Sudas on Shabbos, everything as required by the Din, by the Aloche, except of the things that we couldn't do other things else.
Wow. Okay. So, like you said, you're a real Litvak. So you decided to study Lithuanian, history. So why? I mean, how did you get into studying Lithuanian Yeshivas, though, per se? And you said you're interested in all Lithuanian Jewry, but why did you decide to study and write on Lithuanian Yeshivas, especially as, we'll get to the interwar period, this period between World War I and World War II? Why did you decide to focus on that?
Yeah. During my PhD studies at Tel Aviv University, I began to think what will be my study work, and it was clear for me that it would be in the form of religious life, more or less. And then Professor Elchanan Reiner, he offered me two ideas for research work. One was Reb Chaim Oisler Grozensky and his time, and the Lithuanian Yeshivas in the interwar period. So I decided to choose the subject of Lithuanian Yeshivas, especially since my father was a student of one of these yeshivas in Lithuania, the Slobodka Yeshiva. And so my research was about these yeshivas. And in 2014, I published my research in Hebrew at the Zalman Shazar Center in Jerusalem. And now my new book that you mentioned, issued by the Indiana University Press, is an English version of that Hebrew original. And in this new English version, I added two chapters describing the events during the Second World War from September 1939 to June 1941, the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. And this is a very interesting and meaningful era for the Lithuanian Yeshivas, as it may explain the miraculous revival of the Yeshiva world in our days. So this is more or less the background of my research.
Okay, so I'm just going to read, before I get to the next question, I just want to read the chapters here so listeners can understand a little bit what the book is like about. And then we're obviously going to talk a lot about, things that relate to the book. That you're basically three parts, and you have consolidation and expansion, the renewal of the Yeshiva world, and expansion trends in the Yeshiva world, which we'll get to now. And then you have part two is aspects of the Yeshiva world, economy, studies, leadership, and the Talmidim. Those are a few chapters. And then there's the beginning of the end, where you just mentioned return to wandering and under Soviet rule. So let's start off in this period. At the end of World War I, there's the refugee. As you discussed this in the beginning of the book, but discuss it here. You have the refugee crisis, how the yeshivas were affected. They sent away, they moved, they returned, and all the various yeshivas interwar periods. So talk a little, broadly speaking, about this.
Okay, so we don't pay attention to it that the First World War played a crucial role in the history of the Jewish people. Hundreds of thousands of Jews from the provinces of Kovna, Grodno, Kurland, Suwalki, and later also for the provinces of Vilna and Minsk were forced to leave their homes, either because of the Russian deportation orders or because of fear of the approaching German front. And they migrated to the southeastern provinces of the Pale of Settlement, Poltava, Yekaterinoslav. And when the Russian authorities were forced to open the gates, what they called Holy Russia, before the Jews, the refugees also settled in Russian cities. Now, the yeshivas were part of this process. At the beginning of the war, an emergency situation arose and many yeshiva students returned to their homes. About a third of the yeshivas, let's say 10 yeshivas more or less, especially those whose number of students was not large, were closed. The rest of the yeshivas tried to continue operating until the Great Deportations in May 1915. When the Jews were forced to leave the Kovna province within 3 days, and I'm speaking about 120,000 Jews, the heads of the yeshivas and their students also went into exile. So some of them re-emerged in exile, such as the Knesset Beis Yitzchok of Slobodka, headed by Rebbe Ber Leibovich, which settled in Minsk. And the Ponevezh kibbutz, led by Rabbi Yitzhak Rabinovich, which settled in Lutzin in the Vitebsk province, and later in Mariupol, which became famous recently because of the Russian-Ukrainian war. And as the war front advanced east in July, August 1915, Jews again fled their places, including some of the famous yeshivas, Radin, Novardok, Lida. And in 1916, the front warmed up again, and Jews again migrated, including the Mir and Volozhin yeshivas. So about 10 yeshivas managed to re-establish themselves in the places of exile, but not all of these yeshivas survived the difficult conditions. Among those that managed to survive, I can mention the two Slobodka yeshivas, the Knesset Israel and the Knesset Beis Yitzchak in Kremenchug, the Ukraine, of course, the Mir yeshiva in Poltava, the Radin yeshiva in Snovsk, also Ukraine, the Lomzhe yeshiva in Priluki, and the Novardok yeshiva, which settled in Homel, Belarus, and branches of it were opened in several neighborhoods of Kiev and in other cities such as Rostov-on-Don, Berdichev, Zhytomyr, and more. So when the exiled Jews were allowed to return after 5-6 years of exile, and it should be remembered that this was already during the Bolshevik period in Russia and Ukraine, the yeshivas tried to return to their original locations. Most of them succeeded, such as the Knesset Israel, Yeshiva of Slobodka, Mir, Radin, Lomzhe, but there were yeshivas that had to settle in new places, such as the Knesset Beis Yitzchak Yeshiva, that couldn't return to Slobodka and settled first in Vilna and finally in Kamenetz, and therefore it was known as the Kamenetz Yeshiva, headed by Rebbe Baruch Ber Leibovich. Other yeshivas of the Novardok type, but were opened in exile, had to find new places for themselves. They didn't have an original towns before the war. Yeah, so they settled in Mezrich, Bialystok, Warsaw in Poland, and even in Dvinsk in Latvia. I think that it's worthy to quote the Mashgiach of the Knesset Israel Yeshiva of Slobodka, Reb Nota Yershfinkel, I quoted him in my book. He considered that these difficult conditions that his yeshiva underwent in the Ukraine as a significant source of its strength. And indeed, this unique formative period of the First World War strengthened the yeshivas and their students and prepared them for the complex economic, social conditions that would prevail after the war. And some of these yeshivas really became the supporting pillar of the renewed yeshiva world in the interwar period.
Okay, right. And so just for listeners, in this first chapter, you go through yeshiva by yeshiva as you talk about this. And this is really a lot we'll discuss in the first chapter of the book. And the second chapter of the book, you discuss expansion trends in the yeshiva. So that, how the yeshivas expand and that, I don't know if you want to talk about that, but something else I think a general question we probably should discuss here is like you said, the book is about the Lithuanian Yeshivas. So before we get into general, like I mentioned in the beginning, part 2, where you go through various parts of each yeshiva, like you call it here, economy, studies, leadership, and the Talmidim, what defines a Lithuanian yeshiva exactly?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It seems very simple, but it's not so simple. First of all, I would like to point out that in our conversation, we'll be talking about senior yeshivas. That is, yeshivas intended for young men from the age of 17 to marriage in their 20s or 30s. I'll not talk now about preparatory yeshivas, which are aimed for boys aged 12 to 16. This is another story, and maybe another time we can talk about it. When we examine the studies in the Lithuanian yeshivas, we may be quite surprised. The studies in most of them followed a uniform and very, very simple pattern. The study year was divided into a winter semester and a summer term, And every day, studies were held during 2 sessions, morning Seder and afternoon Seder. And when the students would independently delve into a common Talmudic tractate. Besides their independent study, the students would listen to a weekly or even daily lecture from the Rosh Yeshiva, each yeshiva in its own fashion. So with such a simple pattern, what was really unique about the Lithuanian Yeshivas? What is this? So first, I would emphasize that we don't have to disregard this organizational framework, as exactly this framework is nowadays accepted in most of the yeshivas, the Haredi, the Zionist ones. So for us, it seems very natural. How can it be in other way? But then it wasn't so common. But what is really important, these studies concentrated on abstract, theoretical Talmudic topics which lacked concrete application. We call it Torah Lishma, Torah for its own sake, without any orientation towards rendering legal decisions or professional preparation for the rabbinate. It doesn't say that the students didn't get enough theoretical training to become rabbis. No, I don't say it. Of course, the yeshiva gave them the fundamental knowledge and the ability to study halacha. So if one got a suggestion for a rabbinical position, for example, by the way, a very rare event in those days, he could leave the yeshiva, sit at the Beis Medrash for a few months, and then be ready to his oral exams to get a rabbinical ordination for one of the famous rabbis. But generally, the studies were Torah Lishma, Torah for its own sake. But not only that in the Lithuanian Yeshiva. Up until let's say, the 80s of the 19th century, learning other than in-depth Talmud study was unknown in the world of Lithuanian Yeshiva. But from then on, Musar studies were added alongside the Talmud to the curriculum of the yeshivas. So their aim was improvement of the negative character traits of the students. The time formally designated for Musar sessions was very limited, just half an hour a day before the evening services of solitary Musar study from the classic works of Musar, Mesilas Yesharim, Chovas HaLevavos. But in the yeshiva, from then on, there was a new sort of atmosphere of self-examination and the search for character defects. Besides, Musar talks were given by the Musar Mashgiach, Musar supervisors, a new position in those yeshivas. So in the interwar years, the uniqueness of the Lithuanian yeshiva was its curriculum that included 2 simple subjects: abstract, theoretical, Talmudic topics, which usually a weekly lecture of the Rosh Yeshiva, and the Musar sessions with Musar talks of the Musar Mashgiach. That was the Lithuanian Yeshiva in general.
So just to emphasize, so the yeshivas in Hungary and Poland were not like this?
No, they were quite different. The Hungarian yeshivas concentrated on studies of law codes with the aim of training their students to become rabbis or to be able to derive the right halachic rulings. In the Polish, for example, Chachmei Lublin yeshiva, the Talmidim studied the Daf Yomi, a daily page of Talmud, which was the innovation of their founder, Rabbi Meir Shapira. So this method was completely different from the method of study in Lithuanian yeshivas. Of course, even in Lithuanian yeshivas, there were some that were exceptional. But we are talking here about the rule, and the rule was Torah Lishma.
Okay, so one final, general question was: all these yeshivas were in Lithuania, or were there any "quote unquote" Lithuanian yeshivas out of Lithuania proper?
Yeah, it may be even a funny question, because at first I thought to make my research on the yeshivas in Lithuania only, and then Professor Emanuel Etke said, "What are you doing? Most of the yeshivas are in Poland." So what really was the situation? The yeshivas were called Lithuanian Yeshivas, but in the interwar period, this name was only a cultural marker. rather than a geopolitical one, as the dwelling place of most of the yeshivas was outside of Lithuania. Lithuania between the wars was located on the former territory of the Russian Kovna province and on the part of the Polish Suwałk province. Only 4 yeshivas were located there. The Knesset Yisrael Yeshiva in Slobodka, a suburb of Kovna, the Telz Yeshiva in Telz, the Ponevezh Yeshiva in Ponevezh, and the Kelm Yeshiva in Kelm, which was not exactly a yeshiva like the other ones, but more a training place for Musar Mashgiachim, where only a few dozen students studied there, most of them Avrechim, unlike the other Lithuanian yeshivas, which were usually attended by hundreds of students, and all of them unmarried young men. So where were the other Lithuanian yeshivas located, if not in Lithuania? So, and we are speaking about more than 30 yeshivas in the interwar period. So the dwelling place of most of them was, as I mentioned, in Poland. The majority in the eastern frontier region, known as the Polish Kresy, the Crescent, the Polish Crescent, but some, especially Novarok type yeshivas, settled in the old territories of Poland, the territory called now Kongresówka or Congress Poland. So, however, despite of the different geopolitical location, there was no practical difference between the Mir Yeshiva in the Polish Kresy and the Slobodka Yeshiva in Lithuania. I give it as an example. A student who moved from one of these yeshivas to the other, and there were students who made this move. For example, names like Moshe Higer, Yehuda Frank, Avrom Farbstein, did not find the difference between the two in the academic or social aspects. Of course, there were differences in the economic aspect, but most of the students were not aware of it. So we can say that most of the Lithuanian yeshivas, and it's very funny, most of the Lithuanian yeshivas were located in Poland.
Yeah, it's indeed very interesting. So you mentioned the economics of the yeshiva. So we're not going to, I don't think we really, unless you want to go into that, there's a chapter in here about the economy, as you call it. But something that you did mention before that I do want to pick up on, you have a whole chapter 4 in here is dedicated to studies. And you mentioned they had, first Seder and second Seder is called morning, afternoon Seder, and they had, Mussar Star. But you go through in the book various examples and types of learning and different examples from various yeshivas. I don't know if there's anything in particular you want to mention a little bit more, maybe a little bit about that people might find that interesting.
I would say the method of studies in the yeshivas was the method of we call it the Avona method. It was the system of Reb Chaim Soloveitchik and also of Rabbi Yitzhak Rabinovich. Both of them, let's say, invented this method. It's very more or less similar. They studied together, both of them. They studied together in Brisk, and maybe they had influenced each other. I don't know, but this was the method. This was the method in the Lithuanian yeshivas. Of course, the students of those great rabbis of Reb Chaim and of Rabbi Yitzhak, they weren't. They left the yeshivas. They were all students, and the new students, they only heard about these methods, and they heard it from their rabbis, and they tried to study the Rosh Yeshiva. They tried to study according to these methods, and only in 1936 there was published the Chidushei Reb Chaim. And then students began to be aware to the exact method of the Havona method. Yeah, but before it was only shmues, only rumors. What is really this method?
Okay,
I think also one more fact that the son of Reb Chaim, Velvo Soloveitchik, he opened the kibbutz in Brisk, And some students, the best students of Mir and afterwards also from Radin and other yeshivas, joined him to study the method, the original method of his father.
Just one thing, you mentioned obviously the Brisker Rav there. What is, you said he opened a kibbutz. How would you define the difference between a kibbutz and a yeshiva?
Yeah, usually a kibbutz is a study group without a Rosh Yeshiva that delivers weekly or daily shiurim. Here it was quite different. It was a kibbutz because it was a small group of students, and Rav Velvel told them, I think daily or more or less, almost every day, he told them his studies. So it was like a yeshiva, but it was a very small group. So from one side, you can say that a study group, a kibbutz, is a group that doesn't have a formal Rosh Yeshiva, or from the other side, you can say it's a small group that studies and gets some lessons from Torah authority.
Okay, so let's discuss a little bit Rosh Yeshiva, obviously, and Mashgiach we'll get to also, because obviously that's many of the famous figures. A lot of the yeshivas are famous for the Rosh Yeshiva. Obviously, we have a lot of, they're known, we have a lot of svarim for them, they're Torah, as you mentioned already, a number of them. So that's the next, a chapter in the book where you talk about leadership and you discuss Rosh Yeshiva, and how they were appointed. And we'll get to, I guess, the how patrilineal descent kind of emerged and, issues from that, etc.
Yeah, it's not a simple issue. Usually, the Rosh Yeshiva was the man who established his yeshiva. Naturally, in addition to delivering Talmudic lessons in the yeshiva, he took care of the economic foundations, donations, student selection, and student support. It was clear to everyone, to the students, donors, and to people of the town in which the yeshiva was located, that the yeshiva belonged to its head. It was clear, and he had the right to decide on any matter related to it. Moreover, his standing at the head of the yeshiva was a lifetime position. Yeah, it was clear. And he could have bequeathed it to his successors when he relied or whom he relied on to take care of the continuation of its activity. So now he could not guarantee that his sons would have the appropriate skills, Talmudic and managerial. Yeah, it's clear. But he had another option for which he could choose his successors. He usually had daughters, and for them he could choose suitable grooms from among his hundreds of disciples. And really, this is what usually happened in the Lithuanian Yeshivas. The head of the yeshiva would choose the most outstanding student with the best virtues to be the groom for his daughter and his successor when the day came. So this method was acceptable in the Jewish world, in the yeshiva world, and we can find many sons-in-law as successor of the Rosh Yeshiva. However, some older students would not enter the shiurim of the young sons-in-law. This, for example, happened when the Reb Motel Schulman, the son-in-law of Rabbi Isaac Sher, was nominated the Talmud instructor in the Slobodka Yeshiva, and very few students, if at all, entered his first lessons. On the other hand, when Rabbi Eisel Kostiakovsky became the son-in-law of the Rosh Yeshiva of Lomzhe, Rabbi Yechiel Mordechai Gordon, in 1935, and he was immediately appointed Talmud instructor in the yeshiva, everyone came to his lessons. There was a good reason for this, since he had already gained renown as one of the greatest scholars in the yeshiva world. But all these were small problems in the yeshivas. To enter the shiur of the new son-in-law or not. The real problems that led to sharp controversy were in cases where it was not clear who the heirs were. There were only two such cases in the interwar period. I wrote about them in my book. One of them was in the Slobodka Yeshiva. We don't have time to describe its complexity. It's a whole chapter in my book. But in few words, the founder of the yeshiva was Reb Noto Yeshvinkel, who didn't serve as a Rosh Yeshiva, but as its Musar supervisor. So he appointed a Rosh Yeshiva from outside, and the last and the most known was Moshe Mordechai Epstein. And when time came, it was necessary to decide who would continue to head the yeshiva when it was after the Hebron Yeshiva was established, and Moshe Mordechai moved to Hebron. The question was whether it would be the son-in-law of the yeshiva's founder, Rabbi Isaac Sher, or the son-in-law of the Rosh Yeshiva, and in this case, Rabbi Yosef Zusmanovich, who was also called the Yerushalmi because he came from Jerusalem. And then a severe controversy arose, and it lasted from, let's say, 1925 to 1937, more than 12 years. In Radin, there was more or less the same case. Why? Because the establisher or the founder of the yeshiva was the Chafetz Chaim. And the Chafetz Chaim didn't serve as a Rosh Yeshiva. He nominated a new Rosh Yeshiva from outside. It was Rav Naftali Trop. And Rav Naftali was a well-known Rosh Yeshiva with his genius shiurim. And it attracted many, many new students to the yeshiva. But and by the way, in 1928, 29, the yeshiva reached its peak with about 250 students. By the way, I would say in Mir there were 350 students in that time. But for Radin, it was a peak, 250 students. It was a great number. But then at the end of 1928, Rabbi Naftali Trop suddenly died. And then problems started. Why? Because unlike most yeshivas, where the head of the yeshiva was also the founder and the owner of the yeshiva, in Radin's case, as I said, the owner was the Chofetz Chaim. And he nominated his son-in-law, Mendel Zaks, to be the head of the yeshiva instead of Rabbi Naftali. And he was ready, the Chofetz Chaim was ready to leave the right for Talmud instruction in the yeshiva to the Trop family. But they demanded not one teaching job, but two jobs. One for the son, Rabbi Avrom Trop, and the other for the son-in-law, Rabbi Baruch Yosef Iverson, a Slobodka graduate and a known Ilui. The Chofetz Chaim claimed that he could not meet these demands of the Trop family, and they agreed to only one job and a compensation. Yeah. And all this caused the quarrel and the Din Torah by Reb Chaim Ozer Grozensky. And I can summarize that this quarrel was not resolved until the end of the yeshiva in the World War II, when the yeshiva left Radin and migrated to Vilna and to Eishishok, and the quarrel did not stop. So if I summarize, everything could be okay if the founder of the yeshiva was the Rosh Yeshiva. But we had two cases in which the situation was different, and the founder was not the Rosh Yeshiva. He brought a Rosh Yeshiva from outside, and then the problems began.
Yeah, okay. And like you said, there's more, obviously, you discussed Radin and Slobodka, and there's other, generally you discuss this whole, Rosh Yeshiva position, how they're appointed, and, patrilineal descent and that kind of thing. So the next part we mentioned before already, Mashgiach, what was the, Mashgiach, and when did they come? You kind of mentioned this, but what became the role of the Mashgiach in the yeshiva? And then specifically, I guess, the importance of the role of Mashgiach, and specifically, were there some yeshivas where the Mashgiach was even to an extent more famous than the Rosh Yeshiva, especially thinking of like Rabbi Yerucham, the Lubavitch, and Mir, but in general?
Yeah. We, as I mentioned, the Musar studies were incorporated into yeshiva curriculum during the period of the last decades of the 19th century. It was a period of revolution, and especially at the beginning of the 20th century, the students saw in the imposition of Mussar teachings a clear attempt at tightening supervision over them and limiting their freedom of action. Therefore, many of them sharply opposed Mussar and its representative, the Mussar Mashgiach, and they even avoided encountering him as much as possible. But it was in 1905 and in the time of revolution of this period. In the interwar period, revolutionary attitudes no longer had a place in the atmosphere of freedom which spread over Lithuania, Poland, and Latvia. And the Mussar teachings had ceased to be an excuse for quarreling with the yeshiva administration. Moreover, in the 1920s, Mussar teachings were introduced into the Lithuanian Yeshivas, which had not adopted them previously. So the figure of the Mashgiach became an accepted and leading one in the yeshiva. He knew each one of his charges and his abilities, accomplishments, aspirations, problems, and acted to help them in their difficulties and to direct them in the path what was right in his eyes. His Mussar talks, Shmuisen, which were replete with influential psychological attacks, dealt with the role of the yeshiva bocher in the changing surroundings during his studies at the yeshiva and even afterwards. So the deep impression of these talks not only crystallized the students' worldview, but even relied the entire group of the Talmidim around their yeshiva. And as you mentioned, it happened in Mir with Rabbi Yerucham talks. It happened in Lomza with Rabbi Moshe Rosenstein's ones, and also many other yeshivas as well. And you say that you mentioned that the Mashgiach was in some yeshivas greater than the Rosh Yeshiva. It may be correct, because the Rosh Yeshiva filled various roles in his yeshiva, from delivering weekly lectures to providing material support for each of his charges. And often he was forced to dedicate a significant portion of his time for problems, economic problems, So who was the main figure then? It was the Mashgiach, who was like the minister of interior of the yeshiva. And when the Rosh Yeshiva had to leave the yeshiva and to go to visits in overseas to fundraise money for his yeshiva, then the one who stayed with the Talmidim was the Mashgiach. And of course, in such cases, he became the most influential figure in the yeshiva.
So let's discuss a little bit that. The final thing we'll discuss on the Rosh Yeshiva and leaders of the yeshiva, as you say, is this fundraising aspect. You know, if it's famous, probably a lot of people are familiar. A lot of the Rosh Yeshiva used to go, especially to America, to fundraise. So, I mean, how common was that? And was the purpose really there to raise money, or was it also to raise awareness in general of the yeshivas?
Yes. You know, when as I mentioned, the yeshivas returned from exile after the First World War. So what happened with the American Central Relief Committee, it sent valuable assistance to each of the returning yeshivas from exile. However, due to structural changes made in the JDC, which was the umbrella organization of the 8 committees, and also the changes in the goals of the Central Relief, its support from the American public diminished, and therefore its assistance to the yeshivas diminished as well. At the same time, the economic situation in Europe was also very bad, and the support of the German Jewry for yeshivas stopped. it should be remembered that the students did not pay tuition fees at the yeshivas. But on the contrary, the yeshivas supported their students to enable them to rent rooms and meals. And so it happened that when more and more students joined the yeshivas, then the economic problems of the yeshivas grew more and more. We have to remember that there were almost no restaurants in the yeshivas, and of course there were no boarding schools, and the Talmidim were required to rent rooms in the houses of the residents. And so the deficits of the yeshivas increased as the number of the students increased in the yeshivas, reaching many, many thousands of dollars. And then the heads of the yeshivas had no other choice but to leave their yeshivas and to go on fundraising trips. According to testimonies, the head of the Mir Yeshiva, for example, was almost forced by students to leave for the United States in 1926 to collect money for the yeshiva in order to save it. So if so, it's not a question of travel to expand the future support network, but rather of an immediate rescue of the yeshivas from an economic collapse. Two, the appearance of the yeshiva heads in the United States and the good impression they made influenced many American activists to think of the idea of sending their sons to study in the yeshivas of these esteemed rabbis. But it was only a byproduct. Really, we can find that until 1927, 28, there was no student from America at the Mir Yeshiva, but probably after the visit of Lazer Yudel Finkel there. So in 1932, we find over 30 students from America in the Mir Yeshiva.
Right, now one other thing about America, obviously, famously, Shimon Shkop ended up at YU, or I guess then it was REITs. How did that transpire? What happened there?
The situation in the Grodno Yeshiva in the late 20s was very bad, similar to the situation at the other yeshivas. And like many, many yeshiva heads at that time, Rabbi Shimon Shkop also traveled to America. It's worth noting that he was not young. He was about 69 years old, if I made the correct calculation. And this fact may teach us that there were probably no other choices to save the yeshiva, but to travel himself to collect donations for the yeshiva. At the same time, the Rosh Yeshiva at Ritz, Rabbi Shlomo Polyachik, passed away, and this was a good opportunity to offer Rabbi Shimon Shkop the position. He thought that through this tenure, he could help his yeshiva financially, but his colleagues in Eastern Europe did not like this idea, and especially Rabbi Yerucham even wrote him a sharp letter in which he demanded that Rabbi Shkop return to his students in Grodno, and finally, Rabbi Shkop didn't see any other choice but to return to his town and to his yeshiva.
Okay, so let's just discuss a little bit on moving on to the next part where you discuss the Talmidim themselves. So, I mean, you've mentioned here, but for example, I'm just going to read a little bit like the subheaders in the chapter. You talk in the chapter population in yeshivas, how people choosing yeshivas, relationship with Talmidim in yeshiva, and you go through. You mentioned that we're talking about the age of the Talmidim. So you mentioned we're talking about a little bit of the older one, but if you want to mention something more about the ages, and so on, if you want to just talk a little bit about this chapter where you talk about the Talmidim and the yeshivas.
Yes, we can speak, for example, about the number of students in the yeshiva. In 1924, for example, there were about 300 students in the Slobodka Yeshiva, and it was the biggest number at that time. After that, immediately, because of the recreation rule of the authorities, the yeshiva had to establish a branch in Hebron, and 100 students left the yeshiva and went to Hebron. And only in the beginning of the 30s, the yeshiva, the Slobodka yeshiva, returned to its numbers, 270, 280 number of students in the yeshiva. If we look at that time in the 30s, in the Tel Yeshiva, there were more than 300 students. But there was a difference between the Slobodka Yeshiva and the Tel Yeshiva, because in the Slobodka Yeshiva, the students began their studies from the age of 19, because younger ones, 17 to 19, they had a Mechina or Israel Yeshiva headed by Reb Chatzkel Bernstein. So the Knesset Israel Yeshiva was only for older students, 19 years old and older. In the Tel Yeshiva, they entered the senior yeshiva already while being 17, 18 years old. So this is one of the differences of the yeshivas. If we speak about the Lithuanian Yeshivas in Poland, so Mir, of course, was the biggest yeshiva. In 1935, there were about 400 yeshiva students in the yeshiva. In Kamenetz, there were 300 students. Now, what's very interesting is their attraction to foreign students. We find that in the Mir Yeshiva, in the middle of the 30s, there were 25% of the students were from abroad, from overseas, especially from Germany and from the USA. In TELS, 22% of the students were from abroad, especially from Germany. In comparison, in Slobodka, there were only 11% of the students were from abroad. So we can say that Mir, in the middle of the 30s, was the most attractive yeshiva for foreigners. It was the biggest yeshiva from the number of students point of view. And we can say, luckily, or I don't know if it's the right word, this was the only yeshiva that survived the Holocaust. And its students became the founders of the new yeshiva world after the war.
So one thing that's related to yeshivas is kollel. Obviously, today there's this proliferation of kollel. People, have to get married, stay in learning. What was in those days? Was the Kavna kollel? But what was kollel something that occurred then? What was that? What was that like?
This is a very interesting question, because it may teach us about the difference between those times and our times. In the interwar period, the students, as I mentioned, began their studies in the senior yeshiva at the age of 17 or in Slobodka 19. And these studies continued until their wedding, usually at the age of 25, 6, 27, and even older. So therefore, the study time in the senior yeshiva was about 10 years. And after the marriage, the young man would look for suitable employment to support his family. Only those who excelled in the yeshiva world saw the rabbinical positions as their goal in life and tried to be accepted to a kollel. However, at that time, there were only 2 kollels in Lithuania: the Kovna Slobodka kollel, which operated next to the Slobodka yeshiva and was the most famous kollel in the world. By the way, I guess you didn't know that, but my grandfather, after whom I am named, was the menahel of this kollel and the right-hand man of Rabbi Avrom Duber Shapira, the Rov of Kovna, who served as the president of the kollel. And the number of the avrechim in this kollel were about 20. The second kollel in Lithuania was Kollel Arabonim in Tels, which operated next to the Tels Yeshiva, and had 12 to 14 avrechim. In Poland, there were also very few kollels. The Mir and the Otvots kollel, the kollel Kochim in Radin with 10, 12 students. In Vilna, in Kamenetz, just 7 students, avrechim, yeah? And in the Novardo kollel in Brisk with 10 avrechim. In our days, the situation is quite different. And there are a lot of kollels when every yeshiva graduate after his marriage joins a kollel, or most of the yeshiva graduates. The reason for the multiplicity of kollels in our time compared to their minority in the interwar period is the age of marriage. Today, the guys get married in their early 20s, and therefore their period of study in a senior yeshiva is very short, few years. So their Talmudic educational completion they are already doing in the kollel itself. In the interwar period, there was no need for such Talmudic educational completion.
Interesting. Okay, so just a general question. I mean, you discuss in your book a lot of different yeshivas. We've mentioned a lot of yeshivas here, but what are from the more, most or more, however you want to, stick any words, but something like that, more influential yeshivas of the period?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question because you may look at this issue from several aspects: geography, size of the yeshiva, the sort of the students, the attraction for foreign students, the position of the graduates in Eastern Europe and overseas. I would say, it's my opinion that in Lithuania, the most influential yeshiva was the Slobodka yeshiva. Its graduates are in all the Jewish world, all the religious Jewish world. We can find them in many positions, rabbinical positions, not now, but years ago. In Poland, the most influential one was of course, I can say the Mir yeshiva. Yeah, it had the biggest number of Talmidim. It was the most attractive one for foreign students, and it survived after the war. So many of its graduates established new yeshivas. So we can say that this yeshiva, the Mir yeshiva, was the most influential, even in the last decades. 40, 50 years ago, it was the most influential one.
And what about an unknown yeshiva from this period? Obviously, there are many small ones, but there are some that maybe you mentioned already, even on this episode. But what's something that's more unknown?
This is a difficult question because each of the yeshivas has its own importance. I am reminded of a quote from one of the heads of the preparatory yeshivas, the Ivye yeshiva, not far from Vilna, who wrote to the Vada yeshivas in Vilna that his graduate students do not want to move to the senior yeshivas of Kobrin and Slonim, to where they were directed, because they don't like these yeshivas. And he suggested sending them to the 6th class of the Baranovchi yeshiva, which was considered a preparatory class. In contrast, the graduates of the Rovna preparatory yeshiva wanted only one senior yeshiva, Slonim. And you remember that the previous ones didn't want not Kobrin and not Slonim, and this one only Slonim. So it's very, very difficult to define yeshivas as more or less important because each student had his own opinion about the importance of the yeshivas. For example, one of the Israeli government's ministers, the health minister Eliezer Shostak, from the time of Menachem Begin's government, he wasn't a religious man, maybe an observant, I don't know, but he didn't go with a kippah. He studied at the Koretz yeshiva and appreciated very much. I also consider this yeshiva of great importance, and I write about it in my book. And since I'm sure that only few of our listeners have heard of this yeshiva, it's worth mentioning it a few minutes. We have 2 to 3 minutes. So we must speak about the Talmudic studies in the Ukrainian Volyn province in the Pale of Settlement in the 19th century, which was concentrated in Batei Midrash and Hasidic Shtiblach. At most of the jury and in Volyn was Hasidic. So Volyn scholars tended towards halachic rulings rather than to a Lithuanian Yeshiva style of textual analysis. But then the Haskalah, the Enlightenment worldview, began to penetrate Volyn at the end of the 19th century, and its influence on Volyn's Torah world increased in strength. And the local Hasidic population began to recognize the capability of the yeshivas to serve as a shield against this attack on religious life, and was therefore more willing to accept such yeshivas. And really, the first significant program was the initiative of a graduate of the Volozhin Yeshiva, Rabbi Yoel Shorin. He founded in a town, Berezhnitsa, in 1897 yeshiva, and 2 years later, he transferred it to Zvil. Today, it's called Novogrod Volinsky in Ukraine. And they considered it as an influential focus point for restoring the spirit of Torah to Volyn. Rabbi Shorin grew among Lubavitch Hasidim in Poltava, and in Volozhin he was known as the Eloi of Poltava, and he was well acquainted with the Hasidic mentality. Therefore, he chose to preserve in his yeshiva, at least symbolically, the Volyn style of study, and he included in the daily program of his yeshiva learning of halachic rulings, unlike the accepted course of study in the regular Lithuanian yeshivas. Local Hasidic groups appreciated his program and chose to send their sons to the Zvil yeshiva. And in the course of time, the yeshiva expanded, and an impressive building was constructed along with a courtyard and a large garden. But this growth was halted in the First World War. While the yeshiva continued to carry on undisturbed during the fighting, when the Bolsheviks took over Ukrainian Volyn, a severe change was also felt in Zvil. The new Bolshevik authorities began to make troubles to the yeshiva, and Rabbi Shorin decided that the only choice he had is to leave Zvil and to move to a nearby Polish town, which was called Koretz. Yeah, and from then on, the yeshiva acted in this town. Even in this new location in Poland, it stood out among its Lithuanian counterparts with its emphasis on halachic rulings. In addition to the usual sessions dedicated to Talmud or Orach Chaim, as well as probably other sections of the Shulchan Aruch, were part of its curriculum, a direct result of the yeshiva settling in the heart of a Hasidic area. In an attempt to assimilate into this environment, the yeshiva apparently even adopted the Hasidic rite of prayer, but didn't show any obvious signs of accepting Hasidism. Moreover, the yeshiva adapted itself to its Lithuanian counterparts by studying Musar and appointing a Musar Mashgiach, Rabbi Pesach Plotnik. Now, Zvil Koretz was the first senior yeshiva in Volyn, and in its footsteps, in this Hasidic area, other Lithuanian yeshivas were founded in the interwar period, yeshiva in Ostrog, in Rovne, and Novardok yeshivas in Ludmir and in Lutsk. So if I summarize this peculiar yeshiva or unknown yeshiva, so the Zvil Koretz yeshiva was thus a pioneer in the revolution that the Lithuanian yeshiva world brought about in Hasidic Volyn, a revolution that expressed itself in the 1930s by 5 senior yeshivas and the respectable chain of preparatory yeshivas in this Hasidic area. And I think that this was an outstanding sign of the change of attitude regarding Lithuanian yeshivas that took place among the Hasidic Jews in Volin. And therefore, I attribute such importance to the pioneer yeshiva of Zvir Koretz.
Fascinating. Are there any known or famous figures that learned or studied in this yeshiva?
As I mentioned, Lezer Shostak, who was a minister in our Israeli government. I know of some other graduates, but not of the rabbinical sphere.
Okay, interesting. Now, the end of this book, like I said, originally your book was published in Hebrew as Kitzur Chalamish by Markaz Zalman Shazar. But this volume of the book, you said you added in the beginning of the end, Return to Wandering with World War II, and then the last chapters under Soviet rule. So what did you add now to this English? Basically, what do those chapters talk about that you added to this English translation?
Yes, I think that except of the fact that this era, it was so fascinating, interesting. I know, very sad. Yeah, we know the end of this era. We know what most of the students were massacred in pits in the small towns of Lithuania by Lithuanians, by the local Lithuanians. Yeah, we know this end. But all this story of wandering from Poland of about 18 yeshivas to Vilna, and afterwards they scattered in the Lithuanian towns, it's a fascinating phenomenon. And at the time of the Soviets, there was a possibility for the refugees and also for the yeshiva refugees to get exit permits and to leave Lithuania through Soviet Russia and through Japan and then to America or to Shanghai, yeah, it depends. But not all of them use this opportunity. The only yeshiva we know is the Mir Yeshiva, but almost most of its students, except of a group of 30 students that studied at the townlet of Shat, not far from Tidan, they stayed in Lithuania. But most of the yeshiva students, they got the permits to leave, and in spite of the great risks that they are giving their papers to the Soviet government, and who knows what can happen, and they will be sent to Siberia and will be sent to who knows where. They took the risk, and they survived. Yeah, they survived, and after that we know the end of this story. But in my book, I bring a table, and in this table I have all the wandering yeshivas and what happened to their heads. And we see there that most of the heads of the yeshivas, although we didn't let their students to work on these exit permits, they made efforts to get these permits for themselves, for their families, and they left Lithuania in the last minute. I, of course, in this book, I try to explain it, what they had in their heads, what was the reason that they did it. And by the way, it wasn't the same thing happened also with the Zionist political movements. The heads of these movements also got permission to and permits to leave Lithuania, and they left their members of the movements to stay in Lithuania, and we know their end. They were sent to Siberia, or they were massacred in the pits in the Lithuania. So I think that this is a topic, but it's not discussed. Not discussed in maybe in academic works, yes, but not in quasi-academic works. It will never appear there. And when one of the writers of these such works mentioned that Rabbi Aaron Kotler left his yeshiva and left Lithuania for America, he wrote it in such a complex way that no one can understand what really happened in this case. So I think this is my innovation to show what really happened, and it is very sad. I must say, very, very sad. It was very difficult for me to write this chapter, but we have to know the truth. Yeah, and I don't blame them. Don't understand what I blame the Rosh Yeshiva. They couldn't even imagine in their worst dreams that what will happen to their students. It was impossible to dream about it. No one thought about it, not the Rosh Yeshiva, not anyone else in the world, except, of course, of the Nazis themselves. Yeah, no one could imagine that such a thing can happen to the Jews.
And I'm sure the Rosh Yeshiva would have loved to get all of the Talmidim out. I'm sure it's just something that wasn't possible at the time. So you mentioned something there that we should maybe pick up on a drop more. I mean, what's the current research of the yeshiva? History. This is something you're working on, but between, like you said, academics and versus quasi-academics, university trained people researching this.
So today there are no specific quasi-academic research of yeshivas. There are still very few books on Torah figures who studied in their past in Lithuanian Yeshivas. And I consider these books important ones because they are revealing new sources that were in the hands of the families of these Torah figures and were not accessible in the usual archives. And hence, we see a great importance of these books also for academic research. But comparing the difference between the academic researchers and the quasi-academic ones, one may say that they are very similar in terms of their scientific apparatus. They have the same footnotes and same bibliography, but I see the difference, the main difference is mainly not in what is written in those books, but in what does not appear in these books. I gave the example of the table of the Rosh Yeshiva in the time of the Second World War, which cannot appear in such a quasi-academic work. I have also an older example. For example, there was a book edited by Shmuel Kalman Mirsky about the yeshivas that were destroyed in the World War II, and it was published in 1956. One of the chapters of it was about the Slobodka Yeshiva, written by the yeshiva graduate Ephraim Oshri. Everyone knows Ephraim Oshri. And he included many important details in his important chapter, but one of the major events in the yeshiva, the great controversy over its leadership, which I mentioned before, which in my book occupied a prominent place, is not mentioned there at all. Now, could it be that Ephraim Oshri was not aware of this incident? Certainly not. There was no one who did not know about it in that time. Even my late father, who did not tell much about his period in the yeshiva because I was not too interested in this subject in the past, mentioned among the few details the figure of the Yerushalmi and the controversy surrounding him. So surely Oshri, who studied in the same time of my father, knew about this matter. And if you want a more convincing proof, then in Avram Doris' diary about the Slobodka ghetto, he writes what Ephraim Oshry told him during the time of the ghetto in detail about this dispute. If so, the writer Oshry thought it would not be honorable to tell about the controversy in the yeshiva, and he decided to eliminate it completely. And this approach also continues to this day. No one will write that the yeshiva, Volozhin Yeshiva, had only 50 students in the interwar period at most, and it was closed. It was almost closed in that time. No one will write about it. It's not nice to tell such a story about the mother of the Lithuanian Yeshivas. And so also other facts that maybe appear in my book and do not and cannot appear in the quasi-academic works.
Right, for sure. I mean, one thing you broke up there. Whose diary was that you were quoting from?
Avram Tori. He was one of the Elterson Rat in the ghetto of Kovna Slobodka.
Okay, so first of all, just we're mentioning quasi-academics, non-university trained. I want to give just in general a thank you to Davi Safir who helped me with these questions and in general encouraged me to do this episode. And he writes a lot of excellent research, articles and on things in the Mashgiach magazine. Now, your sources for this. So how did you go about researching this, and what sources did you use? I want to mention, just because I want to make sure I mention this, I'll mention this here, that you don't have footnotes, you have endnotes, but the way you put the endnotes, they're in this book at the end of each chapter. So not like in a general book at the end of the book, they're at the end of each chapter. But in general, the sources, what sources did you use to research this?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, my book covers the whole world of Lithuanian Yeshivas in the interwar period, about 35 Yeshivas in Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, as I mentioned. And the main source of this very wide research was the collection of Vada Yeshivas, which survived World War II, and it is now at the Yeshiva Archives in New York. This collection mainly includes letters, documents from the yeshivas to the Central Yeshiva Committee in Vilna that deal specifically with the economic aspects of those yeshivas. However, an in-depth study of this vast collection of documents taught me a lot, not only about the economic aspects, but also about other ones, social, educational, leadership, historical, and the like. Aside from this very important collection, I also used those quasi-research works that I mentioned earlier, very important sources for me, as well as the few studies which are written about this or that yeshiva, most of them concentrated on the time before the interwar period, and they gave me a good background to my research area.
Okay, now you mentioned a couple of other works, like you said. So are there what others? Obviously, there's your book, and I'm going to link to it in the show's notes. I'll link to people can purchase the book. And as well as there is the Hebrew edition from Zalman Shazar, if anyone is interested in that as well. But the new one, like I mentioned, is brand new from Indiana University Press. But what other suggested reading, especially in English, would you recommend?
Yeah. So first, there is the English book by Shaul Stampfer, The Lithuanian Yeshivas of the 19th Century, that describes in detail 3 Lithuanian Yeshivas from their founding until the First World War, Volozhin, Slobodka, and Tels. And it gives a very, very good background of the modern yeshiva world at all. There is also a book in English by Shai Rosner, Legal Thinking in the Lithuanian Yeshivas, about the method and the works of Rabbi Shimon Shkop. It's not a pure history, but still it has strong connections to the Lithuanian Yeshivas. I know there are also articles of Professor Benjamin Brown on Musar supervisors, and I think that some of them also appear in English. Unfortunately, there is an important book in Hebrew, meanwhile in Hebrew, by Shlomo Tikuchinsky about the history of the Slobodka Yeshiva in Eastern Europe until it's moved to Hebron in 1924, 25, and then to Jerusalem. Another book is Memoirs of Yeshiva Students, edited by Emmanuel Atkes and Shlomo Tikuchinsky, also, unfortunately, meanwhile in Hebrew, but mainly concentrates in the last decades of the 19th century and the time before the First World War. These are more or less the main sources that it's valuable to read them.
Okay, I'll try to link to them. So finally, as a final question, what about for yourself, future projects? Are there any other new books now that you're working on, whether in Hebrew or English?
Yeah, the last book has a general attitude, especially examining common processes and only rarely identifying uniqueness of some of the yeshivas, some quarrels, and some other things. I think it's time to concentrate on monographs on some of the more interesting yeshivas. As I have the raw material I have in my possession, now it's time to do something with it. And I believe that the readership will find them of great interest. So this is my next goal, Bezrat Hashem.
Okay, sounds good. And we're looking forward. And thank you for joining me to discuss the book and the topic. It was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much.